The hydrophone operator's hand froze over his equipment dial. It was March 17th, 1944, and Oberleutnant Sur. C. Klaus Bargston had just heard something that shouldn't exist. Through the North Atlantic's cold water, the passive sonar array aboard U-521 was picking up not one destroyer's screw signature, not two, but 5 distinct propeller patterns moving in coordinated search formation. And beneath them all, a deeper, heavier thrumming something massive, something that had no business being in the middle of the Atlantic hunting submarines. Bargston pressed the headphones tighter against his ears, his breath catching. The sound signature was unmistakable, an aircraft carrier. But that was impossible. Aircraft carriers belong to great fleet battles in the Pacific, not to the lonely grey expanses where U-boats stalked convoys. Yet there it was, the rhythmic pounding of reduction gears driving a ship displacing thousands of tons, surrounded by a protective screen of destroyers, all moving in a search pattern that was tightening like a noose. In that moment, listening to the acoustic evidence of American industrial might deployed for the sole purpose of hunting his submarine, Bargston understood that everything he'd been taught about the nature of this war was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The transformation of the Battle of the Atlantic, from a battle of convoy defense to active submarine hunting, represented one of the war's most dramatic tactical evolutions, and for the men who crewed Germany's U-boats, it marked a psychological reversal almost impossible to comprehend. When Klaus Bargston graduated from the submarine school at Pillow in East Prussia in 1942, the doctrine drilled into every U-boat officer was clear and unwavering. The submarine was the apex predator of the Atlantic, a lone wolf with the initiative, stealth, and striking power to devastate enemy shipping while remaining virtually undetectable. The British and Americans, they were taught, could only react defensively, huddling their merchant ships into convoys protected by a thin screen of destroyers that were perpetually overextended, under-equipped, and unable to prosecute contacts effectively. The mathematics of naval warfare, as presented by Großadmiral Karl Dönitz himself, were simple. If Germany could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would starve, and the war would be won. This doctrine was not theoretical fantasy, but empirical reality, at least in the early years. During the period U-boat crews called the Happy Time, from June 1940 to October 1940, and again from January 1942 through August 1942, German submarines operated with near impunity along the American east coast and in the mid-Atlantic gap beyond effective air cover. The numbers were staggering. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, U-boats sank more than 3 million tons of Allied shipping, often surfacing at night to attack coastal merchants silhouetted against the lights of American cities that had not yet implemented blackout procedures. Individual boats like U-48, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Bleichrod, sank over 20 ships in a single patrol. The psychological reality of those patrols shaped an entire generation of U-boat men. The sense of being hunters, not hunted, of possessing a technological and tactical advantage that made them masters of the ocean's dark spaces. Klaus Bargston had absorbed these lessons thoroughly during his training. The submarine arm, the U-Bootwaffe, was an elite service within an elite navy, recruiting men with technical aptitude and steady nerves, then subjecting them to months of intensive instruction in everything from diesel engine maintenance to torpedo ballistics. The training facility at Pillow processed hundreds of officers and crew through a curriculum designed around the tactical realities of 1941 and 42. They learned to approach convoys surfaced at night, using their low profile and small silhouette to evade detection. They practiced diving to evade depth charge attacks, using the ocean's thermal layers to hide their acoustic signature. They studied the effective range and pattern-running characteristics of British and American depth charges, which typically had to detonate within 20 feet of a submarine's pressure hull to cause catastrophic damage. They were taught that if they could dive deep, stay quiet, and wait out the initial attack, the hunters above would exhaust their ammunition and be forced to withdraw. The submarine, in this doctrinal vision, always held the advantage of patience and concealment. The Type IXC U-boat that Barkston joined as watch officer in January 1944 was a sophisticated machine built to prosecute this doctrine. At 252 feet long and displacing 1,546 tons surfaced, U-521 was one of the largest operational U-boats in the Atlantic Fleet, designed for extended patrols far from European bases. Her twin diesel engines could drive her at 18 knots on the surface, while electric motors provided 7 knots submerged. She carried 22 torpedoes, a mixture of electric G7E models that left no wake, and compressed air G7A torpedoes with longer range. Her crew of 48 men lived in conditions of almost unimaginable confinement, sleeping in hot bunking rotations, sharing a single toilet for the entire boat, breathing air that grew progressively more foul as the patrol extended and the carbon dioxide scrubbers became less effective. But these were accepted hardships, the price paid for belonging to the elite arm that was supposedly winning the war at sea. What none of Barkston's training had prepared him for what the instructors at Pillau could not have prepared him for, because the tactical reality was changing faster than doctrine could adapt, was the American response to the U-boat threat. While German submarine construction focused on building individual boats with longer range and heavier armament, the United States industrial base was solving the problem through a completely different calculus. Overwhelming force applied systematically. The concept of the hunter-killer group represented a radical departure from convoy defense doctrine. Instead of waiting for U-boats to attack convoys and then responding reactively, the Americans would create dedicated task groups whose sole purpose was to hunt submarines proactively. Each group centered on an escort carrier, a small, mass-produced aircraft carrier built on a merchant hull supported by a screen of destroyer escorts. These groups would patrol known U-boat transit routes, respond rapidly to any contact reports, and pursue submarines to exhaustion or destruction. The industrial capacity required to create such groups was staggering, and it was capacity that Germany simply did not possess. The escort carriers, designated CVEs in American naval terminology, were being produced at a rate that would have seemed fantastical to pre-war naval planners. The Casablanca class alone eventually numbered 50 ships, each displacing 10,400 tons and carrying 28 aircraft. These were not fleet carriers. They were too slow, too lightly armored, and too small for combat against enemy surface fleets. But for hunting submarines, they were perfectly adequate. Their aircraft could range hundreds of miles from the carrier, extending the search area exponentially beyond what surface ships alone could achieve. And if the United States could spare entire aircraft carriers for submarine hunting, complete with destroyer escorts that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars each and required months of construction time, what did that say about the true depth of American industrial power? This was the reality that Klaus Barkston had begun to suspect but could not quite accept as U-521 departed her base at Lorient, France, in early March 1944. The strategic situation had deteriorated markedly over the previous year. Monthly U-boat losses had climbed from 10 or 15 boats in early 1943 to 41. Boats lost in May of that year alone. A month the survivors called Black May. The mid-Atlantic air, gap, that precious zone beyond effective Allied air cover where U-boats had once operated freely, had closed. Long-range B-24 Liberators, fitted with improved radar, could now patrol the entire Atlantic. The Allies had broken the German naval codes, allowing them to route convoys around known U-boat patrol lines. And most ominously, there were reports, unconfirmed, fragmentary, but persistent, of entire American task groups operating in areas where no convoys were present, apparently hunting submarines for the sake of hunting submarines. Still, the doctrine held. Individual U-boats were still dangerous. A well-handled boat could still evade detection, approach a convoy, and strike. The war could still be won if enough Allied tonnage was sent to the bottom. Barkston believed this because he needed to believe it, because the alternative that they were now the hunted, that American industry had solved the submarine problem through sheer, overwhelming material application, was too psychologically destabilizing to accept. U-521's patrol orders were straightforward. Proceed to a position west of the Azores, intercept convoy traffic bound from America to Britain, attack and evade. The transit across the Bay of Biscay, that deadly gauntlet where U-boats were most vulnerable to Allied air patrols, passed without incident. Once in the open Atlantic, Barkston settled into the rhythm of patrol operations, running surfaced at night to charge batteries and make passage, diving during daylight hours when aircraft were most likely, maintaining strict radio discipline to avoid Allied high-frequency direction-finding equipment that could triangulate a U-boat's position from brief transmissions. For 10 days, they saw nothing, no convoys, no warships, just the empty grey expanse of the March Atlantic. Then, on the morning of March 17th, the hydrophone operator reported multiple propeller contacts at bearing 270, range indeterminate but closing. Captain Lieutenant Hermann Landschultz, the boat's commander, ordered the boat to periscope depth for a visual observation. What Barkston saw through the attack periscope's narrow field of view made his stomach tighten. 5 destroyers or destroyer escorts, moving in a coordinated search pattern, their bows throwing white water as they zigzagged at high speed. And behind them, unmistakable despite the range, the rectangular profile of an aircraft carrier, smaller than the fleet carriers he'd seen in recognition manuals but still massive, her flight deck visible even at 8,000 meters. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Landschultz cycled through the periscope bearings, his face drawing tight. "Hunter-killer group," he said quietly, stating what everyone in the control room had already realized. "This is no convoy escort. They're hunting." He lowered the periscope, and U-521 dropped silently to 120 meters, the crew securing for silent running. In silent running, every system that produced noise was shut down or minimized. The electric motors were throttled to their lowest sustainable speed, providing barely enough steerage way to maintain control. The ventilation, fans were switched off. Men moved in, stocking feet on the deck plates. Even conversation was reduced to whispers. The boat became a steel coffin drifting through darkness, hoping that American sonar would pass over without detecting the small, quiet return that might betray their presence. The hydrophone operator continued his reports in a whisper. "Contact, bearing 285, classified destroyer, range decreasing. Second contact bearing 270, also closing. Sir, they're bracketing us. Multiple active sonar pings, bearing 290. Active sonar meant the Americans knew roughly where they were and were refining the contact. The pinging sounds transmitted through the water and the hull, a metallic echo that seemed to grow louder with each repetition. Barkston watched the depth gauge needles holding steady at 120 meters below the thermocline, they hoped, where temperature differences might deflect sonar beams. But if the Americans had multiple ships, working a coordinated search, they could probe through the thermocline with overlapping search patterns. Minutes stretched. Then the hydrophone operator stiffened. New contact, bearing 010. Aircraft engine signature, single prop, descending. The sound of the aircraft grew rapidly louder, then a tremendous detonation shook the boat, throwing men against bulkheads. Depth charges, but not close, perhaps 200 meters away. The hunter-killer group's aircraft had dropped a pattern based on the last known position, attempting to force the submarine to move or reveal itself. Landschultz held U-521 motionless, counting on the ocean's vastness to hide them. But the Americans were patient, and they had resources. Over the next hour, the hydrophone tracked multiple aircraft sorties, each one dropping patterns that walked progressively closer to the submarine's position. Surface contacts maintained their search grid, their propeller noises weaving back and forth in a methodical pattern. This was not the hasty, ammunition-limited response of an overtaxed convoy escort. This was systematic, resourced hunting, with plenty of depth charges, plenty of aircraft, and no apparent time pressure to break off and rejoin a convoy. The hunter-killer group could afford to spend hours, even days, prosecuting a single contact. At 1500 hours, a depth charge pattern detonated close enough that light bulbs shattered throughout the boat. Cork insulation rained from the overhead. A pipe fitting cracked, sending a spray of seawater into the engine room before damage control teams sealed it. The boat's stern rose slightly ballast or trim system damage that required careful compensation. Still, Landschulz held his course and depth, knowing that any significant change in speed or aspect would be detected immediately. The psychological pressure was immense. In the cramped, darkened control room, men stood at their stations with expressions of rigid concentration, each man fighting his own private battle against the urge to panic, to do something, anything, to escape the methodical pounding from above. What made this experience so psychologically devastating for Bargston and his crewmates was not just the immediate danger they had trained for depth charge attacks, had understood intellectually that this was part of submarine warfare, but rather the creeping realization of what this hunter-killer group represented in material and strategic terms. The arithmetic was inescapable. That escort carrier above them displaced at least 10,000 tons, required hundreds of crew, carried dozens of aircraft, and consumed thousands of gallons of fuel every day. Each destroyer escort represented months of construction time, hundreds of tons of steel, and millions of dollars in equipment. And the Americans had deployed all of this an entire task group not to protect a valuable convoy, but simply to hunt submarines in open ocean. The implication was staggering. America possessed such overwhelming industrial capacity that it could afford to build entire carrier groups as expendable assets in a subsidiary theater of a global war. The German Naval High Command had briefed U-boat commanders on American industrial production figures, but the numbers had seemed abstract, almost theoretical. Intelligence reports stated that American shipyards launched a new Liberty ship every 42 days on average, later reduced to an astonishing 24 days at the peak of production. But hearing such statistics in a briefing room in occupied France was entirely different from experiencing their tangible result, being hunted by weapons systems so numerous that the Americans could afford to dedicate them to purely offensive operations. Every U-boat man knew the basic equation of the tonnage war. Germany needed to sink more ships than the Allies could build. But if America was building not just replacement merchant ships, but also constructing entire naval task forces specifically designed to hunt submarines, then the fundamental calculus of the Atlantic campaign had already shifted beyond recovery. At 1600 hours, U-521's batteries had depleted to 30% capacity. The boat had been submerged for nearly 6 hours, running silent on minimal power. The air had grown thick and foul, the carbon dioxide scrubbers struggling to maintain breathable atmosphere. Men's faces had taken on a greyish cast in the dim red emergency lighting. Landschulz faced an impossible choice. The boat would need to surface after dark to run the diesel engines and recharge batteries. But the hydrophone still tracked surface contacts all around them, and the Americans almost certainly had radar-equipped aircraft that could detect a surfaced submarine at night. The hunter-killer group was not withdrawing. They were settling in for a prolonged hunt. Surface contacts bearing 320, 285, and 045, the hydrophone operator whispered. They're maintaining a triangular pattern. Range to nearest contact approximately 4,000 meters. The destroyers had U-521 boxed. Any attempt to slip away at periscope depth would likely be detected by the overlapping sonar coverage. The only option was to go deep and stay deep, hoping the Americans would exhaust their patience or be called away to higher priority targets. But what higher priority could there be than confirmed submarine contact? In the old calculus, convoy escorts might have to break off to rejoin their convoy. But a dedicated hunter-killer group had no convoy to rejoin. Their entire purpose was to prosecute exactly this type of contact. Bargston moved through the boat, checking on the crew. In the forward torpedo room, men sat on their bunks between the reload torpedoes, breathing shallowly, not speaking. In the engine room, the diesel mechanics waited beside their silent engines, ready to restart them the moment, if the moment came, when surfacing was possible. The diesel engines were magnificent machines in their own right, 9-cylinder supercharged monsters that could produce 2,400 horsepower each, but they were useless while submerged, and the electric motors that provided underwater propulsion were draining the massive battery cells with every minute that passed. At 17:30 hours, another pattern of depth charges detonated, this time close enough that the shock wave threw Bargston against a bulkhead, the impact driving the air from his lungs. The boat heeled sharply to port as water flooded through a sprung seam in the pressure hull. Damage control teams fought to shore the leak, while Landschuls compensated with ballast tanks, fighting to maintain depth control. The boat was taking damage, not catastrophic yet, but accumulating. Another close pattern might rupture the pressure hull entirely, sending 2,000 tons of seawater crashing through, the compartments faster than any watertight door could be sealed. What Bargston and his fellow officers could not know, but sensed with growing certainty, was that they were experiencing the maturation of an entirely new tactical system. The escort carrier USS Block Island, which centered this particular hunter-killer group, was part of a class of ships that represented American industrial philosophy made manifest. Built on maritime commission hulls at a yard in Oregon that had never constructed a warship before the war, the Casablanca-class carriers were designed for rapid mass production. Their turbine engines were prefabricated in multiple sections and assembled in the hull. Their welded construction, rather than traditional riveted assembly, allowed unskilled labor to participate in shipbuilding. Their armament was standardized 28 aircraft, one 5-inch gun, 16 40mm anti-aircraft guns, making supply and maintenance straightforward. The Americans had essentially industrialized naval warfare, applying mass production techniques to weapon systems that European naval theorists still considered bespoke instruments, requiring years of careful construction. A fleet carrier like Enterprise or Yorktown took 3 to 4 years to build and represented a massive capital investment that had to be protected carefully. But a Casablanca-class escort carrier took 7 months from keel laying to commissioning and cost a fraction as much. The United States Navy would eventually commission 50 Casablanca-class carriers, 50 making them more numerous than any other aircraft carrier class in history. This meant that if a CVE was lost hunting submarines, it was tragic for the crew but strategically negligible. American industry would replace it within months. The destroyer escorts that screened Block Island embodied the same philosophy. The Edsall-class and Buckley-class destroyer escorts, designated DEs, were smaller and slower than fleet destroyers, but they were purpose-built for submarine warfare and could be produced in enormous quantities. By war's end, American yards would launch over 400 destroyer escorts. Each carried depth, charge racks and throwers, hedgehog anti-submarine mortars that could fire patterns ahead of the ship, and sophisticated sonar equipment. Each represented the application of industrial capacity to a tactical problem. The United States was building submarine hunters faster than Germany could build submarines. At 1900 hours, with battery capacity at 20% and carbon dioxide levels approaching dangerous concentrations, Landschuls made the decision. "We surface after full dark," he told his officers. "If we stay down, we suffocate, or the batteries die and we're forced up anyway. At least on the surface we have speed and the possibility of escape." It was not optimism, but calculation. A submarine's maximum submerged speed was 7 knots. On the surface, U-5-21 could make 18 knots fast enough, perhaps to evade destroyers in darkness if radar detection could be avoided, or if American radar was less effective than feared. Full darkness came at 2100 hours. The hydrophone operator reported the surface contacts had pulled back slightly, maintaining sonar contact but no longer pressing close. Possibly they were waiting, confident that the submarine would have to surface eventually. Landschuls brought the boat to periscope depth, scanning the surface in the fading twilight. No visual contacts. He ordered the boat to surface. U-5-21 broke through into cold night air, water streaming from her conning tower and deck. The bridge watch scrambled up through the hatch, scanning the horizon with binoculars while below, diesel engines coughed to life and began their bellowing roar. The boat turned west-northwest, running at maximum surface speed, bridge lookouts straining to spot aircraft or surface ships before they were spotted themselves. For 10 minutes, nothing. Men began to hope. Then the radar warning receiver, a primitive device installed as a retrofit, emitted its distinctive warbling tone. They were being painted by American radar. Within seconds, the hydrophone operator shouted up from below, "High-speed screws, multiple contacts, all quarters." The destroyers were closing at flank speed, and then, impossibly, the darkness above them was split by the brilliant cold light of parachute flares. An aircraft invisible and unheard over the noise of the diesels had dropped illumination, turning night into day. U-521 was caught on the surface, her dark hull suddenly visible for miles, destroyers converging from 3 directions. "Crash dive! Crash dive!" Landschultz shouted, and men tumbled down through the conning tower hatch as ballast tanks flooded and the boat nosed downward. They had gotten perhaps 30 minutes of battery charging, not nearly enough, but staying on. The surface was suicide. The boat slid beneath the waves just as the first destroyer roared past overhead, the thunder of its propellers filling the hull like the sound of tearing steel. Depth charges began detonating before U-521 reached 100 meters, the patterns walking across the area where she'd dived, each explosion a hammer blow against the pressure hull. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Through the night, the pattern repeated. The hunter-killer group had U-521 pinned. American radar detected each surfacing attempt within minutes. Aircraft dropped flares and marked the position. Destroyers raced in to force the boat under with depth charges. Each dive depleted batteries that never fully recharged. Each depth charge attack caused more damage. Small leaks that became larger leaks. Equipment failures, hull plating that creaked, ominously under pressure. The boat descended into a spiral of exhaustion and failing systems. By dawn on March 18th, the situation was critical. Battery capacity was below 10%. The air was so foul that men could barely remain conscious. The carbon dioxide scrubbers were saturated and ineffective. Light bulbs had been removed from all non-essential spaces to conserve power. The boat's speed underwater had dropped to 3 knots as Landschultz hoarded every ampere of remaining battery power. But the hydrophone still tracked multiple surface contacts, still reported the steady pinging of active sonar, and overhead they could hear aircraft engines. Block Island had launched her dawn patrol. In the stifling semi-darkness of the control room, Klaus Bargsten performed a calculation that he did not share with the crew but that Landschultz understood without words. They had been under continuous attack for approximately 24 hours. The Americans had dropped Bargsten, estimated based on the number of distinct detonations over 100 depth charges. They had launched multiple aircraft sorties. They had maintained a screen of at least 4 destroyers continuously on station. The expenditure in fuel alone must have been staggering, thousands of gallons per hour. The ammunition expenditure represented tons of high explosive. The aircraft sorties burned through aviation fuel, engine hours, pilot fatigue, and the Americans showed no sign of breaking off. They could afford this. They could afford to spend days hunting a single submarine, to exhaust every resource necessary to ensure the kill, because the resources were functionally inexhaustible. This was the psychological shift that changed everything for Bargsten. Not the fierce submariners accepted that death was an occupational hazard, but the mathematical certainty that Germany had already lost the war. If America could produce weapons in such abundance that an entire task group could be committed to hunting individual submarines with no resource constraints, then every U-boat in the Atlantic was not a hunter but a target. The tonnage war was lost, not at sea, but in the factories and shipyards of a continent that could outproduce the entire Axis combined. At 0730 hours on March 18th, with battery capacity approaching 0 and men beginning to lose consciousness from carbon dioxide poisoning, Kapitän-Leutnant Landschultz gave the order Bargsten had known was coming. Prepare to surface and abandon ship. Destroy all code materials and confidential documents. Open the seacocks after we're clear. To remain submerged meant death by asphyxiation. To surface meant capture but survival. The choice was obvious. U-521 rose through the grey Atlantic water one final time, broaching in full daylight less than 2,000 meters from the nearest destroyer Escort, USS Eugene E. Elmore. Crewmen boiled up through the conning tower hatch, gulping clean air. While below, the engineering officer opened seawater valves, and the boat began to flood. Within minutes, destroyers surrounded the stricken submarine, their guns trained but not firing, as German sailors jumped into the cold water. The Americans lowered boats and began picking up survivors, efficient and professional, while behind them, U-521's bow rose high as water rushed into her flooded compartments, and then she slid backward into the depths. 300 feet of water swallowing the boat that had been home and weapon and fortress. Klaus Bargston, pulled from the Atlantic by American sailors, found himself on the deck of USS Elmore wrapped in a blanket, shivering not just from cold, but from the totality of the transformation he'd just experienced. Around him, other survivors sat or lay on the deck, guarded by American sailors who offered coffee and cigarettes with an almost casual friendliness that seemed surreal after 30 hours of methodical hunting. The destroyer's deck was crowded with equipment, radar aerials, depth charge racks, anti-aircraft guns, and everywhere, signs of material abundance. The steel was fresh, the paint new, the equipment modern. This was not a ship carefully husbanded and maintained beyond its design life. This was a ship built months ago, one of hundreds just like it, produced as casually as Germany might produce trucks. An American officer, speaking serviceable German, conducted brief interviews with the survivors. When he reached Bargston, he asked routine questions, name, rank, service number, and then, almost conversationally, "This was your first encounter with a hunter-killer group?" Bargston nodded. The American officer smiled without malice. "We have 12 groups operating in the Atlantic now. More coming. We're hunting every U-boat position we intercept, every contact we develop. The days of convoy defense are over. We're taking the fight to you. 12 groups. 12 aircraft carriers with their destroyer screens, dedicated solely to hunting submarines. The number represented industrial capacity so vast that it redefined what warfare meant. The survivors were transferred later that day to USS Block Island, the escort carrier that had coordinated their destruction. Walking onto the carrier's hangar deck, Bargston experienced another shock of recognition. The space was enormous, housing 28 aircraft in neat rows, Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers configured as submarine hunters, carrying depth charges and radar. Spare parts lined the bulkheads in organized bins. Aviation fuel tanks held thousands of gallons. The ship's crew moved with casual efficiency, maintaining aircraft that would go out tomorrow to hunt other submarines. This was not a desperate improvisation or a carefully husbanded strategic asset. This was routine industrial warfare, one carrier among dozens, prosecuting one submarine among hundreds, all part of a mathematical equation that Germany could not possibly win. In the POW holding area, Bargston spoke quietly with his fellow officers, and the conversation turned to the same inescapable conclusion. One of them, the boat's engineering officer, said what they were all thinking. They don't need to be better sailors. They don't need to be braver. They just need to be richer, and they're richer than we ever imagined. The comment was not bitter but observational, the recognition of a fundamental strategic reality that German naval doctrine had failed to account for. Victory in modern industrial warfare did not go to the side with superior tactics or training or even technology, though the Americans were rapidly closing those gaps as well. Victory went to the side that could produce more weapons, deploy more forces, and sustain higher losses while continuing to increase production. The Type IXC U-boat, that sophisticated machine in which Bargston had placed such faith, required approximately 1 year to build in specialized submarine yards using skilled labor and scarce resources. Germany's maximum submarine production during the war reached approximately 40 boats per month at peak capacity in 1943. The United States, in that same period, was launching multiple escort carriers per month, dozens of destroyer escorts per month, and hundreds of anti-submarine aircraft per month. The arithmetic was devastating. Even if every U-boat destroyed significant Allied tonnage before being sunk, American industry could replace the losses faster than German yards could build new submarines. Barkston and his fellow survivors spent the remainder of their war in POW camps in America, first at a facility in Maryland and later in Texas. The camps themselves provided another education in American material capacity. The food was abundant, not luxurious, but plentiful in a way that shocked men who'd been living on Germany's increasingly restricted rations. The barracks were new construction, built specifically to house POWs, representing an expenditure of resources on prisoners that seemed incomprehensible. The guards were casual, even friendly, not because they were soft, but because they could afford to be. There was no desperation in America, no sense that every resource must be hoarded because replacement was uncertain. Through the camp grapevine and carefully monitored news reports, the German prisoners followed the war's progression. In June 1944, the Normandy invasion succeeded, supported by an armada of ships that dwarfed anything Germany could have assembled. By December, the Battle of the Bulge failed despite Germany's last major offensive effort, stopped not by superior Allied tactics, but by overwhelming material superiority. American forces could afford losses that would have crippled the Wehrmacht. And throughout, the hunter-killer groups continued their work in the Atlantic. By war's end, Allied anti-submarine forces had sunk over 700 U-boats. The tonnage war that Dönitz had promised would starve Britain into submission had instead devoured the Kriegsmarine's submarine arm in a grinding mathematical calculation of production versus destruction. In the POW camp, Klaus Bargston had time to reflect on the doctrine he'd been taught and the reality he'd discovered. The German Naval High Command had made a fundamental error, not in their tactical assessments, but in their strategic assumptions. They had calculated based on military factors, tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, submarines available versus escorts deployed without fully accounting for the industrial capacity differential. Germany's economy was powerful by European standards, but it was structured around precision manufacturing of limited quantities. German factories built excellent submarines, but they built them slowly, each boat requiring skilled workers and specialized materials. American industry approached the problem differently. They designed weapons for mass production, simplified construction processes, trained semi-skilled workers in specialized tasks, and scaled production to levels that simply overwhelmed opposition through quantity. The escort carrier that had hunted U-521 was not a particularly sophisticated ship. Her aircraft were effective but not exceptional. Her destroyer escorts were smaller and slower than fleet destroyers. But she existed along with 49 sister ships because American industry could build her quickly, crew her adequately, and deploy her operationally while still maintaining production of fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, merchant ships, landing craft, and the thousands of other vessels that filled American naval rosters. Germany could never have matched this production even if her entire economy had been devoted to naval construction, because the industrial base simply did not exist to support such output. After the war, Bargston returned to Germany and eventually wrote a memoir of his service, joining the small library of U-boat accounts that emerged in the 1950s and 60s. His account focused not on heroics or drama, but on the mathematical reality of industrial warfare. The moment on March 17, 1944, when he first heard the acoustic signature of that hunter-killer group, represented for him the instant when theory collided with reality, when German naval doctrine encountered the unmovable fact of American industrial supremacy. Everything that followed the 30-hour hunt, the forced surfacing, the capture was merely the working out of that initial realization. The psychological transformation that Bargston and thousands of other German servicemen experienced was profound and permanent. They had entered the war believing in the superiority of German training, German equipment, German tactical doctrine. They encountered an enemy who did not need to be superior in those dimensions, because they had solved the problem differently. By producing so much materiel that they could afford to be profligate, to dedicate entire task groups to hunting individual submarines, to replace losses faster than they occurred, to experiment with new tactics because failure was tolerable when success could be achieved through sheer weight of numbers. This realization extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. If America could dedicate such resources to a secondary theater, the Atlantic was secondary for the United States Navy, whose primary focus was the Pacific War against Japan. Then what did that imply about American capacity in primary theaters? What did it mean for Germany's overall strategic position when their most capable opponent was fighting a two-ocean war while simultaneously supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and still had industrial capacity to spare for building weapons in quantities that seemed unlimited? The hunter-killer groups that emerged in 1943 and 44 represented more than just a tactical innovation. They represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself, from a contest of skill and courage to a contest of industrial capacity. In previous wars, including the First World War, industrial capacity mattered but was not necessarily decisive. Superior tactics, better training, or battlefield brilliance could compensate for material disadvantages. But by the Second World War, industrial capacity had become so dominant that it overrode other factors. An American sailor with 3 months' training, operating equipment that was merely adequate, could defeat a German submariner with years of experience and excellent equipment because the American was backed by an industrial system that could afford to send 12 carrier groups hunting submarines while simultaneously conducting offensives in Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa. Claus Bargston lived until 1978, long enough to see Germany rebuilt and the Cold War establish new military equations. But he never forgot the moment when he first heard those propeller signatures through U-521's hydrophones. The moment when he understood that everything he'd been taught was wrong, that the war was already lost, that no amount of skill or courage or tactical excellence could overcome the simple mathematical fact of American industrial capacity. It was a lesson learned at great cost, in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, surrounded by destroyers that existed only because America could afford to build them, could afford to use them for single-purpose hunting, could afford to lose them if necessary, because more were already being built. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Germany needed to win to have any chance of defeating Britain, ended not with a climactic battle, but with this kind of grinding arithmetic. By 1944, the hunter-killer groups had made U-boat operations not just dangerous, they had always been dangerous, but mathematically futile. For every merchant ship a U-boat might sink, American yards launched 3 more. For every convoy a U-boat might attack, American industry deployed 2 more escort groups. The equation could not be balanced through superior tactics or equipment. It could only be overcome by matching or exceeding American production capacity, and that was impossible. In his memoir, Bargston described the war's final irony, the moment of Germany's greatest submarine technological advances, the Type XXI U-boat with its schnorkel allowing underwater diesel operation. Its improved speed and range came too late, entering service only in the final months of war when the Atlantic battle was already decided. Even if these advanced submarines had been available earlier, they would have faced the same fundamental problem. They could be built slowly, one at a time, while American hunter-killer groups could be deployed in ever-increasing numbers. Technology mattered, but production mattered more. The hunters and the hunted had reversed roles not through some tactical masterstroke, but through the patient application of industrial capacity over time. The U-boat men, who had felt like apex predators in 1942, found themselves by 1944 to be targets, not because they had become less skilled, but because their opponents had industrialized the solution to submarine warfare. Every U-boat that left port faced not a handful of overtaxed escorts, but a systematic network of hunter-killer groups, long-range aircraft, code-breaking intelligence, and improved weapons, all deployed in quantities that made individual submarine operations increasingly hopeless. For Claus Bargston, the war ended on March 18, 1944, in the cold Atlantic, listening to the sound of American destroyers converging from all sides. But in another sense, the war had ended much earlier, perhaps, in 1941, when America entered the conflict, perhaps even in 1939, when the initial decisions about resource allocation were made. The rest was merely the working out of industrial mathematics, the inexorable arithmetic of production and destruction, playing out across thousands of miles of ocean in encounters like the one that sent U-521 to the bottom. The men who survived those encounters came home changed, carrying with them a recognition that the nature of warfare itself had fundamentally shifted. Victory no longer belonged to the bravest or most skilled, though those qualities still mattered. Victory belonged to those who could produce more weapons, deploy more forces, sustain more losses, and continue fighting not because they were heroic, but because their factories and shipyards made continuation possible. It was a bitter lesson, learned in darkness and pressure and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with fear. But it was a lesson that defined modern warfare for decades to come. The destroyer escorts that hunted U-521 were not particularly glamorous ships. They do not appear prominently in histories of the war. They did not sink battleships or support dramatic amphibious assaults, but they represented something more profound than individual tactical victories. They represented the application of industrial methodology to warfare, the transformation of combat from an art to an engineering problem that could be solved through sufficient application of resources. The men who served aboard those destroyer escorts were not necessarily better than their German opponents, but they were backed by an industrial system that made their individual skills almost irrelevant, that could afford their mistakes, that could replace their losses, and that ultimately ground down opposition not through brilliance, but through relentless, systematic, overwhelming material superiority. That was the lesson Claus Bargston learned in the North Atlantic in March 1944, and it was a lesson that echoed through military thinking for generations afterward. In industrial warfare, the factory is as important as the battlefield. Production capacity is a weapon as deadly as any gun, and the side that can build more weapons faster will eventually prevail, regardless of all other factors. It was not the lesson he had expected to learn when he graduated from submarine school in 1942, but it was the lesson that the cold Atlantic waters taught him, and it was true. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.